Peter Zeihan combines a deep understanding of geography, demography, energy, and trade to help his clients make sense of a complicated world. Fortune 500 companies, trade associations, policymakers, and government agencies at all levels regularly rely on his expertise. Peter is also a critically acclaimed author. His first two books, The Absent Superpower and The Accidental Superpower, are recommended by Mitt Romney, Ian Bremmer, and Fareed Zakaria. His third book, Disunited Nations, became available March 2020, and his fourth book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Mapping the Global Collapse of Globalization, became available in June 2022, and I advise you get it. On Saturday, Peter was on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, has 7 million subscribers and 190 million downloads a month. Rogan said Peter's perspective on global interaction is uniquely comprehensive. Please welcome Peter Zeihan.
I apologize for getting you to the open bar early. This delay brought to you by the FAA and apparently Mayor Pete. Anyway, we're going to jump right in. We've got to start with the war. What we're looking at here are a couple of maps of the Russian space. They are tilted on their side because I'm an author, and if you have to tilt your head to follow along, that is fine. I'm not going to judge out loud. On the right, that orange is, the lighter color of orange is population density, and it's roughly the population density of Kansas if you melon scoop out Topeka and Kansas City. So you do know your neighbors. You've probably lost track of their day-to-day lives. If you go to the left, you are now looking at an economic and climate map. And that green V in the middle that roughly overlaps where the people live, that's the Russian wheat belt. And in economic terms, of the world's major agricultural zones, that is the least productive spot on the planet. You can grow one crop of short season wheat per year, and that's it. In the summer, the climate is about like western Kansas. And in the winter, it is roughly like northeastern Alberta. So hot and dry, or cold, dry, windy. The income that comes from that one crop of wheat is so low per acre that the Russians, even today, have never been able to successfully build a road network. Ugh. You want to move anything of volume in the Russian system, you have to do it by rail. Now, if you move it to the left, if you go to the yellow to the south, that's desert, completely empty. If you go to the right to the blue, you're now in tundra and taiga, also empty. But what really drives the Russians to drink is the beige. Territories that are completely empty and by Russian definition totally useless, but totally flat. And you can totally get a Mongol horde through that. Russia's been invaded 50-odd times in its history. And never once, when the foe has made it to the green, made it to the good land, have the Russians ever ejected them. It's been the weather that's done the heavy lifting. So the Russian strategy since the beginning has always been the same. Expand out of the green through the beige, and you get to those red markers, those geographic barriers that you can't shove a panzer division through. And then you forward position your very, very slow-moving rail-supplied troops in those blue access points that are between those barriers. The Soviet system was the height of Russian security. They controlled all of those access points, and then they lost them all. Post-Soviet Russia, especially under Putin, has spent every waking moment trying to rebuild that outer shell. And in the 23 years that Putin has been in charge, he has launched now 8 military conflicts with that in mind, to rebuild those footprints. This is the Georgia War, this is the Crimea War, the Donbass War, the Kazakh intervention, the Karabakh War. Unfortunately for Ukraine, it's not that Ukraine controls these access points, but it's on the way to the 2 most important ones. And as long as that is the case, Russia will not stop until it has all of Ukraine, and then it will continue beyond Ukraine. We're only midway through this story. Now, you guys remember back in the first week of the war when we thought this was going to all be over really quickly? How on the fourth day we had that 40-mile-long convoy of vehicles going from Belarus south towards Kiev? It was like, crap, this is it. And then on the fourth day of the war, the convoy stopped because they forgot fuel. And then on the seventh day of the war, all the soldiers dismounted from their equipment and walked back to Belarus because they also forgot food. And everyone I know at every defense ministry across NATO thought the same thing. Well, holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a modern war at all. They've forgotten all of the lessons they've learned in the last 200 years. It's a parade force. They're doing worse than the Iraqis did in 1992. If we go head to head with Russia, there will be 1,000-to-1 casualty ratios. It will be a wipeout. And this made no one happy at all, because the Russians see this war accurately as an existential battle for their survival. They know if they fail at this, they are completely exposed to whatever's next, and their demographic situation is so horrible. This is the last generation that they have soldiers to fight. So if we do have a direct confrontation with NATO, they will use every tool they have, and there will be a general nuclear exchange. So the decision was made very, very early in Washington and London and Berlin and the rest that we have to destroy the Russian military capacity to function here, now, in Ukraine, but without a single set of NATO boots on the ground. And so any equipment that the Ukrainians can prove that they can operate competently, that doesn't violate our security, they can have. And there's right now 60,000 Ukrainian troops training across NATO countries right now. They will all be back in theater by May when the spring offensive begins. That was our lesson. The Russians had their own lesson. They're like, okay, maybe we drank a bit too much of our own Kool-Aid. Maybe these are not Jewish Nazi gay demons, and maybe they're just people who are fighting for their home. And if that's the case, if they're going to fight for their home, then the civilian population is no longer a non-issue. It's a problem. Well, we can reach into our own history and find a strategy for that. We could advance very, very slowly behind a never-ending hail of artillery fire, not targeting anything that moves, targeting anything that stands. Because if we can obliterate every scrap of civilian infrastructure, then Ukraine cannot support an industrial level population. And the population will self-segregate into two groups. Group number one will run. We never have to worry about them again. Group number two, if they stay behind and they're under age 55, they clearly stayed to fight and we can shoot them on sight. Getting good data out of a war zone is always hard, especially when one side is pathologically lying about any data that there might be. We don't know how many people have been killed, how many civilians have been killed. The estimates I've seen are somewhere probably between 100 and 300,000. That's approximately the same pace in the first year of the Holocaust during World War II. This war, like everything with the Russians, is ultimately about scale. You can see that Texas is up there to give you an idea of scale. The Russians are trying to build a defensive perimeter on a border that's 3 times the length of ours with half the population. And they're trying to do it with numbers. Okay. What we're looking at here is a map of the conflict zone. Now, those dotted lines are those all-important rail lines. The deep red are the territories that the Russians controlled at the end of the last war. Remember, this is the 8th time that the Russians have launched a military attack since 1999. The really fun part starts right here. This is the Kherson Pocket. This is the only chunk of territory that was west of the Dnieper River, that's kind of like their Mississippi, that the Russians were able to capture early in the war. And starting in about July, the Ukrainians advertised publicly that that's where they were going first. This is the chunk of territory they wanted to liberate first. The Russians saw those advertisements, and so they moved about 25,000 of their best forces to the other side of the river to reinforce. Best equipment they have. On November 1, that assault did begin, but as we all know, that wasn't the whole story. There was also a second assault right here because the Russians had to move their troops from somewhere, and the Ukrainians waited to see where they were being pulled from. And in that assault, the entirety of Kharkiv province fell within 5 days. Even better than that, this little dingleberry right here, you guys see that? That is Izium. That was the Russians' forward logistical base. It's a rail hub. They were planning on launching multiple assaults from that next spring to basically capture a huge chunk of Ukrainian territory. It fell in 36 hours, intact. And in 36 hours, the Ukrainians captured more gear, more tanks, more artillery, more shells, more gasoline from the Russians than they started the war with. More than we had transferred to Ukraine in 7 months. Big win. And then they went on to capture Kherson as well and got about half as much, again, equipment. So the Ukrainians at the moment are going through 6 months of deferred maintenance on a lot of Russian gear with the hope of getting it all into working order by the time we get to May. Which means that now we're in a bit of a different kind of conflict. Things are kind of stalled because the weather has been weird. Normally at this time in the year, everything would be frozen solid and you'd have tanks running around everywhere. But it's abnormally warm throughout Europe, including in Ukraine. It's about 40 degrees in Kiev today, which means everything's really muddy. And we're not talking like Louisiana mud here. You know, you can like have a fan boat and go over that crap. We're talking about like deep, churning, clay-based mud, and you can't run tanks through that. That's stalled everything for the moment, but it's absolutely made this a war of logistics, which the Russians aren't great at. So what's going on is the Russians are normally moving everything by train, remember? This black arrow right here pointed up, that's the Kerch Strait Bridge. That is the only rail connection from Russia proper into the southern front. Somebody blew it up a couple months ago. Kerch Strait Bridge, only rail connection between Russia proper and the southern front. So they now have to move everything by truck. You guys remember all those Javelin missiles from earlier in the war? For the most part, the Ukrainians were not using them to target tanks. You know, infantry versus tanks, that's not a lot of fun. So they shot at the trucks. Russia only started the war with about 3,000 tactical support trucks for its entire military. They have lost about 2,300 at this point. So in order to keep things running, because moving things by truck takes about 4 times as long and 10 times as much fuel as doing it by rail, they're having to go back to Russia proper and confiscate things like city buses and literally Scooby-Doo vans to shuttle things around the front. Now, you've all seen Scooby-Doo. Imagine the Mystery Machine loaded up with artillery shells. You know, you don't have to get shot at for that to get really exciting. And the explosions that we're seeing on the highways in southern Ukraine are of substance. But the real fun is not here yet. 2 things. Number one, by the time we get to May, we're going to be in a different sort of conflict. Number one, all that deferred maintenance will be done, and those 60,000 troops that are training in NATO countries will be back with new gear, probably including some battle tanks. It's a fundamentally different Ukrainian force, order of magnitude more powerful than what they began with last February. Mobile, precision weapons, and a lot of them. But the Russians will have completed their second mobilization, and they will have thrown at least 500,000 more soldiers into this fight, an increase of a factor of 4 from what they began with. Now, yes, they will be badly led and badly equipped and badly trained and with poor gear and low morale. But you know what you call soldiers like that? Russian. There is nothing about the war to this point that is atypical in Russian history. The first year of every Russian war is always a complete and utter shit show. And then they throw bodies at the problem. And in half of those wars, that does it. In the other half, it leads to a government collapse. It's way too soon to know which one of these it's going to be. But by the time we get to May and June, we're going to have a really good idea of which strategy is ultimately going to win in time. Doesn't mean it'll be over in June, but we should have a really good idea. That's number one. Number two, Russia has never, ever, ever backed down from any war without one of two things happening. Number one, the government collapses at home. I think the chances of that are minuscule. Number two, they lose at least 500,000 soldiers to combat. We're at about 100,000 right now. So the Ukrainians either have to attrit 4 times as many forces minimum as they have to this point, which would be bloody to say the word, or they have to trigger a mass fatality event. And they have a way to do that. The Crimean Peninsula is an agricultural zone. Roughly 3 million ethnic Russians live there. But it's all irrigated. 80% of the food production there is with irrigation. This blue line right here, that's the Crimean Canal. Its sluice gate is in Kherson, and the Ukrainians now control it. They're not going to turn it on come planting season. The way Ukraine probably is going to win this war is by triggering a 1980s Ethiopia-style famine in Russian-controlled territory, which is where the best troops that Russia have are currently stationed. One way or another, the scale of this is only beginning to be felt. Okay. That's the tactical, that's the strategic. Let's talk about the economic. If you take everything that Belarus and Ukraine and Russia, the belligerents, do, put into a single bucket, they are collectively the world's largest supplier of the first column, second largest for the second, and so on. I could speak for hours on this one slide. I did so at the CIA for 4 hours back in October. Yeah, that was no fun at all, because they're like asking all these questions, but they won't answer any of mine. When the Soviet system collapsed back in the 1990s, the entire industrial base just went down. But they didn't lose their power generation. Now, the Soviet system was one of the few parts of the world that didn't have access to bauxite, which is the precursor material for aluminum. So what they did in the 90s, since they had all this spare electricity and no industrial production, is they imported all kinds of bauxite from other places, used their spare power to turn it into metal, and then export it. Most of that bauxite came from either Australia or Ireland, 2 countries that have been relatively enthusiastic about sanctions on the Russian system. So that's shut down. Titanium, the ore comes from Ukraine, it's processed in Russia. So that's gone to zero. You guys remember Brexit? I mean, isn't it hilarious that we don't even think about the Brits anymore? As an American, I really enjoy that. Okay. When the Brits left the EU, they neglected to figure out what was next. And they've come to the conclusion, grudgingly, that the only way that Britain will be a successful economic player moving forward is if they enter into a free trade deal with the North Americans, primarily the United States. We've got some very clear ideas on what they have to do to make that happen. One of the many, many, many things that they're going to have to do is leave the Airbus family of European aerospace companies and join Boeing. This is where it gets fun. Britain's contribution to Airbus are engines and wings. Most of the aluminum from the former Soviet world goes to Airbus. Most of the titanium goes to Airbus. So the future of European aerospace are jets without titanium, aluminum, engines, or wings. Talks amongst yourselves. All right, what else? The blue, neon and platinum. These are core components in semiconductors. The platinum, the palladium, the rhodium, those are all core materials to regulate electrons. And the neon is used in cartridges which focus the apertures of the etching lasers in the semiconductor fab facilities. Now, neon is made in a 2-step process. Step 1, you have an air separation unit which is attached to a steel mill. In the former Soviet world, those are almost exclusively in southern Russia. They are all under sanction, and they all are barely operating anymore. The second stage is you take your first stage air separation and all the gases that you don't use when you're making steel, so anything that's not nitrogen or oxygen, you put into a canister, you send it off to this more advanced facility, and you separate out all the trace gases: helium, argon, carbon dioxide, neon. Those facilities were in Mariupol, and Mariupol is gone. So we've lost now 70% of global neon, which means in about a year, we have to figure out what we don't need microchips for, because we won't be able to make as many. It's aerospace, automotive, agriculture, satellites, phones. We don't know. Oh, it gets better, because not everyone can make all microchips. We and the Taiwanese and the Japanese and the Koreans, we make the really high-end ones and the medium quality ones. But the bargain basement ones, the ones that are like in your smart pen, or maybe your dryer so it like sings to you when it's done, those all come from China. Guess where the other 30% of global neon comes from? China. So the one type of chip I would argue that we can get just fine without, maybe the only ones that we're gonna have. And the technical economic term for a situation like this, where you've got a disconnect between supply and demand because of security reasons, it's roughly fuck. Okay, the brown. Russia's the world's #1 wheat exporter. It's invaded the world's 5th largest wheat exporter and is deliberately targeting every piece of physical infrastructure it can see, with an extra emphasis on agricultural infrastructure. No way we're not going to feel that soon. But it's the red that really worries me the most, because the Russian space is the world's largest supplier of the stuff that allows people to grow their own food. Of most concern, 40% of global potash comes from Russia and Belarus. Now, the story varies greatly based on which specific nutrient or combination you're looking at. But somewhere between 20% and 40% of all of them have been reduced out of the Russian space. One of the weird little things about Russia is most of their petrochemical facilities were built in the 60s under Khrushchev. And the only reason they're still operating is you've had a lot of Western technology and Western investment and Western workers basically applying a lot of high-end duct tape to keep it all working. And they are now all gone. And we are already seeing industrial accidents in Russian industry that are so big, not that we can see them from orbit, we can detect them from orbit. All right, what's next? What we're looking at here is a pipeline map. Specifically, we are looking at the green pipes. Those are the oil pipes, and the 2 arrows are pointing at a pair of ports, one on the Baltic Sea in the north, that is Primorsk, and one on the Black Sea in the south, that's Novorossiysk. And the reason that these really matter is insurance. And I can just see everybody like, work with me? It gets really sexy really fast. You cannot have a vessel go into a port, out of a port, or go through a constrained waterway like, say, Suez without an insurance policy. And as of the first of the year, the Europeans said no ship can get one of their policies. That's 90% of global coverage. In addition, the global reinsurance companies, those are firms that insure insurance companies, without sanctions in play again, just said we're never touching another Russian vessel again. Now, you're going to see in the news things about the price cap. That's all wrapped up into this. And everyone talks about the price cap because, ooh, sexy, they can only get like $40, whatever. It's the insurance that really matters, and it's already gone. So we have seen in just the last week and a half, exports out of the Russian space drop by about 1.5 million barrels a day. Now, anything more than where we are now, that 1.5 million, things get really, really fast. Because this isn't Texas. In Texas, if for whatever reason the ports can't get rid of the crude, they just shut in the well. They don't like to do it, but they can do it. But in Russia, if you shut in a well in the permafrost, which is where most of this stuff comes from, it freezes solid. And the water that comes up as a byproduct turns into ice, and when we're in Louisiana, you're like, what? What's ice? It's like, when water freezes into ice, it expands, and it pops the pipe from the inside. Now, they've got about 1.5 million barrels a day that's further west that's not on the permafrost. That they can turn on and off. Any more than that, they're cutting into the permafrost wells. And the last time the permafrost wells went offline, it was 1989, and the Soviet system collapsed, and they lost the entire network. And it took them 30 years to repair the damage. It's not quite right. It took Western techs 30 years to repair the damage, and the Western techs are gone. So we can very easily see a scenario where 2 to 4 million barrels a day of Siberian crude goes offline and does not come back for decades. And energy is not a normal product. You know, if you can't get wheat, you can eat corn. If you can't get corn, you can eat soy, whatever. If you can't get fuel, things stop. If you need a gallon of gas to get to work, but you can only get 9/10 of a gallon, not only will you pay whatever you have to do to get that last little bit, the price you pay for that determines the entire market. So just losing 2 million barrels a day of Siberian crude, you know, that's enough to jack energy prices up by $60, easily. And there's more where that came from. So remember, green's oil, right? We're now looking at the reds. The reds are natural gas. We're gonna start with that blue line. I'm sorry, that blue arrow at the top. That's the, noun failure, that's the Nord Stream pipeline. It's not the marginal supplier for the Germans, it's their primary, it's 40% of the total. So, you know, a 2% change in supplies can generate a 50% change in price. This is 40% of their total demand. And back in September, somebody blew it up. It's gone, it's not coming back, can't be repaired because there's now water corroding it from the inside. It's been too long. Americans talk a good game when it comes to paranoia about energy security. We're like, oh my God, energy independence, we gotta get it. We really don't care. We bring in energy from Canada or Mexico or Saudi Arabia, and if we don't think anyone is really watching all that closely, we'll happily take a bunch from Venezuela. You can't do that in Germany. Precision manufacturing in a tough neighborhood. And not only do they bring in the natural gas to generate power, that's not its primary use. Its primary use is for petrochemicals. And those petrochemicals are not exported, no. They're kept in-house to be processed into regular manufactured goods. It's the base of the entire system. And it stopped. Now they have replaced that 40% with 7 different marginal suppliers. And so prices are 6 and 7 times, as a rule, of what they were before the war. Now, if you've been following the news there recently, they're having a freakish heat wave in Germany too. It hit 50 degrees on New Year's in Berlin, which is like 185 billion degrees above normal. And so they're not using a lot of natural gas right now, and prices are really under control. But that's what it took. They shut down their industrial usage of the stuff. They halved their electricity generation. And it took a freak heat wave for them to get things back under control. And in order to do that, they only had to pay 7 times market price for the natural gas. Can you imagine what happens with a cold snap? And they're never gonna refill with Russian natural gas again. They can't. Oh, and it'll get worse because those red arrows, that's the backup plan. Pipes that go through the conflict zone in an artillery war. Folks, if you want a Beamer, buy it now. This is the last model. You should probably get 10 years of parts too. But we're looking at the end of the German manufacturing system in less than 2 years. The closest natural gas to Germany that's not Russian is in Nigeria. That's a 15-year program at least to get it online in there. All right. Oh, this is fun. So Chairman Xi of the People's Republic of China, head of the Communist Party, has now consolidated more power unto his person than any human in history. More than Caligula of Rome, more than the Kim dynasty in North Korea, more than anyone at any time in any place. And as a result, things are breaking down. Even if he were the smartest person in human history, you can't manage a system of 1.5 billion people by yourself. And he has now executed the messenger so many times that no one wants to bring him any information. Not information that they think will piss him off, any information, because they don't know the status of the voices in his head. and they don't know what will trip him. So, great example. You guys remember last February? February before last? Sorry, New Year's, everything's fuzzy. February of 2021. The Chinese were experiencing rolling black and brownouts. Best guess is that Xi didn't find out until September. You know who told him? Joe Biden. On a phone call. Just came up in conversation. Now, we're in the South. I'm going to guess that there's some fairly well-formed opinions about Uncle Joe in this room. But do any of us know anyone who thinks of Uncle Joe as a source of breaking news? Last February, just before the Ukraine war started, during the Olympics, Putin was in town, and he lied to Xi's face. Xi asked him, are you going to invade Ukraine? And Putin was like, oh, why would I do that? It would be crazy. And you can see in the press conference, like the national security guys in the back of the room, like, I feel like I should, and the other guy's like, no, shut up. You know what happened to the last guy? And so Chairman Xi was the only world leader got caught completely with his pants down. He's bought into the Russian propaganda. And so he doesn't probably realize that they're about to lose a lot of Russian crude because of what's going on in the West with the sanctions. But he's also probably about to lose a lot of crude from eastern Siberia, because not one well in eastern Siberia was built by the Russians. It was all done by BP, Halliburton, and the rest, and they're all gone. We've never had this sort of technical pullback from an oil project anywhere in modern history. We don't know how long the Russians can keep this going. But since you can see the accidents from orbit, I'm going to guess not all that long. They're buying their own propaganda. Oh, let's talk about COVID. That's fun. Whee! Okay. I'm going to guess that we have been exposed in our personal and our professional lives to a diversity of thoughts on COVID. And I think most of them can roughly go into one of two buckets. So bucket one, natural immunity is the way out of this. Bucket two, vaccines are how we move on. But I think if we're all being really honest with ourselves, not each other, not with me, with ourselves, at home, in the dark, with the doors locked and the blinds pulled, alone, we will admit that there's some points on the other side of the discussion that are worth considering. Is that fair? Can't have that conversation in China. And not simply because it's an information-controlled area. The CCP was successful at keeping COVID out of the general population. No one has natural immunity. And every country that has tried the Chinese vaccine has sent it back because it doesn't work. What's going on in China right now, we don't know where this is going to go. But we have never seen a population so big and so unprepared subjected to something like this ever. All of the current strains that we have data on, which isn't all of them, I'll admit, show that the strains circulating in China are not a communicability that is in excess of measles. And two of the strains, the ones that we think are dominant, were only identified about 2.5, 3 months ago. And it usually takes about 6 months of data before you really get an idea about fatality and communicability. So we're not going to have that data for a while. In fact, it's going to be longer than it sounds like, because the Chinese have gone from collecting data and lying about it. So in all of December, 12 people in China died of COVID. Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. It's like the last day they collected data, only 6,000 people out of 1.5 billion caught the thing. Right. Anyway, they've gone from collecting data and lying about it to just not collecting data at all. Because what we're seeing is a breakdown of decision making. Remember, one-man government, dictatorship. All policies start and end with the chairman. And if there's no direct guidance from him, you either run on cult of personality decision making, you do what you think he wants, and that's how they start going out and disinfecting airport runways. Or you do nothing. So we may never know how many people die here. The lowest realistic estimate I've seen is 1.5 million. But that assumes that the healthcare system doesn't break down. And we know that their fever clinics, which are their traditional first line of defense, have mostly closed because they can't find staff that don't have COVID. We don't know. And it's not going to stay limited to health. Here in the United States, we've got a diversified democratic system. We've got local government and state government and federal government. We have academia and business and civic organizations. And if one stumbles, the whole system doesn't fall apart because the others are still there, giving legitimacy and decision-making power overall. And so if some idiot glues their hand to a painting, or a bunch of housewives when curlers start screaming, "Let's go Brandon," at a food mall, our civilization doesn't end. But everything in China is one guy. And within 4 days of those protests over Thanksgiving, people weren't just protesting COVID lockdowns, they were protesting Xi's personal skill set. We've had a crack, and we don't know where that's going to go. But it's rarely good. And then let's talk about tech a little bit. There's this weird belief in the United States in particular that China and the United States are technological peers. And no. We make the high end. China makes the low end. But it's not as good as it sounds, because they can't make the high end, they can't make the mid quality, they can make the low quality, but they can only make the low quality with imported equipment, imported tools, imported software, and imported labor to do the quality checks. Well, back in December, the Biden administration put in a series of executive orders that said you can no longer buy the equipment or the tools or the software, and any American working in that sector now has to choose between their job and their citizenship. That was the bulk of the workers. Within 24 hours, every American in the sector was either transferred abroad or quit. It's over. It's already over. And anything that comes from semiconductors is over as well. That's AI, that's hypersonics, that's the Great Firewall, that's automation. It's all already over. China can assemble, and that's not nothing, that's huge. But a technological peer, it is not. They have spent the last 25 years, over $2 trillion US, and a bottomless amount of intellectual property theft to try to move beyond where they are right now. And they can't, because that takes a degree of cross-brain work that they don't train for, that you can't just teach, it's part of your culture. All right, let's talk finance. This is net worth in the United States by age bracket, 10-year age bracket. Now, as you get older, you get better at your job, you get raises, you start businesses, maybe you run a farm, you just get richer. But the real magic happens at age 50, because that's when your single largest expense, your last kid, leaves home and is someone else's problem. A lot of people just turned 50, huh? All right. And then with that extra money, you pay down your second biggest expense, which is typically your mortgage. And by 55, on average, that's paid down to zero. So that last decade, 55 to 64, the last decade that you're working is the wealthiest you will ever be. And the capital that you generate in that decade of your life is what drives the entire global system. It is literally where the money is. That is 70% of global private capital. Now you turn 65 and that changes. If there's a currency crash or a market crash, you won't have the income to recover. So you have to liquidate your holdings and go from, say, stocks and bonds to T-bills and cash. Perfectly normal. Everybody does it. And normally it doesn't matter, because normally we have a demographic structure that looks like this. It's a standard pyramid. Children on the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. This is Nigeria, nearly pre-industrial. And normally, when you turn 65 in a system like this, it doesn't matter, because there's more people 64 below and 63 below that. And the proportion has more or less held in this shape for the entirety of human history until 1945. Because that's when the Americans changed the way the world worked. At the end of the war, we found ourselves facing down Stalin and the Red Army. We're like, oh, we're gonna need some help with this one. And so we did the most reliable thing we could to build up an alliance. We bought it. We created globalization. We used our Navy to patrol the global ocean so that anyone could go anywhere at any time and interface in any market with any partner. And that changed the way national economics worked. Pre-1945, if you had food, oil, coal, and iron ore, you could industrialize and develop and expand. But if you lacked any of those, you were probably a colony. 1945 and globalization changed that. Now anyone could go and trade for anything, so you only needed one of the four. You could trade for the others. So at different paces, from different starting points, we all started down the path towards industrialization. And when you industrialize, family economics changes, because you move off of the farm and into the city to take the industrial jobs. On the farm, kids are free labor. You have as many as you can, because free's great. But in an urban condo, kids are really expensive, really loud, really annoying, really dirty habits. And adults aren't dumb, so we had fewer of them. And 70 years on, we changed from this to this. Suddenly it matters if you turn 65. The baby boomers are the largest generation we've ever had. They're retiring. In fact, in the fourth quarter of last year, we hit the midpoint. Half of them have already retired. And they've liquidated their stocks and their bonds, and they've gone into T-bills and cash, and the velocity of money has already gone into screeching reverse. We've known that this has been coming since the last baby boomer was born in 1966. Are you ready? Nobody is. That means that between January of 2021 and December of this year, the cost of capital always had to go up by at least a factor of 5 in the United States. We're about halfway through that transition. There's a long way to go. And this is independent of anything the Federal Reserve does. The fact that we're struggling with a potentially turning economy, business cycle, inflation, that's just bad luck. There's also a workforce issue here. Boomers, largest generation ever. The Zoomers are the smallest generation ever. Last calendar year, the difference between the exiting boomers and the entering Zoomers was 400,000 worker shortage. That figure will increase each and every year until 2034, when it will peak at 900,000. How do I know this? All the Zoomers are already here. We already know the precise inflow into the workforce for the next 20 years. Is that bad? Yeah, but it is so much worse everywhere else. Now, those blue arrows in the US one, those are pointing towards the millennials, and they are the people who will save us all. Literally just threw up in my mouth a little bit. The baby boomers are right now in their 20s and their 30s. They're at the peak of their consumption, and that consumption is driving our economy right now. If it wasn't for millennial consumption since 2007, we would have already had at least 3 recessions. In addition, in 10 years, the oldest millennials will be in their 50s. I don't know about you, but I cannot wait to see the millennials having midlife crises. But that means they're going to be entering that capital-rich period of their life, replacing the boomers as the source of capital. Gen X is just too small. And perhaps even more importantly, the millennials, late start, are finally having kids in number, which means in 20 years, their kids will start entering the labor force in numbers. All we have to do to get back to 2019 capital and labor environment is wait 10 years for finance and 20 years for labor. That's it. We just have to wait 10 years. Yeah. But check out Germany. Bottom fell out of the birth rate 70 years ago. They ran out of kids 30 years ago. And this decade, that big bulge moves into mass retirement. The German economic model was always going to collapse this decade. The Ukraine war is just speeding it up. And then there's China. That is already the fastest aging workforce on record in human history. And we now know that that data is wrong. A little over a year ago, the Chinese admitted publicly that they had overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people. With all of the missing millions, people who would have been born under the one-child system, meaning that they're all 40 and under, suggesting that these yellow bars, those yellow bars don't even exist. We don't have an economic model. Humans don't have an economic model for how that might work in the year 2030. This is China's last decade, period. I could give you a half a dozen other reasons why China's going to collapse, but this is the one that is completely unavoidable. There is no policy that can be adopted by any combination of countries that can save them from this. All right, let's talk about you. These solid red lines are where the urban center stops because of geography. The dotted are where the cost of expansion goes up. Check out you guys in the middle. I mean, yes, you've got like a protected wetland right there, but honestly, it's so small you can go around it. One of the big things to keep in mind if your intent is to change the economic destiny of your locality is, taking an accurate stock of your assets and your liabilities and taking a really good hard look at your local geography and your regional geography. And in your case, there are no real limits to where you can go. You've got some of the cheapest land in the country, you've got access to a river, but there are a couple of problems. The first one, the most significant one, is you're close to New Orleans. And that's not because everyone's gonna go party there on a Thursday. No. The problem is New Orleans is the world's largest bulk export terminal. And so anything that was in about 600 miles of it, the decision has been made over and over and over and over to just not move up the value-added chain. Produce a raw commodity, ship it to New Orleans, they send it over the horizon, and that's the end of the story. It's cheap, it's easy, it's boring, and it limits what you can do. Now, I want to compare a few other zones that I've worked with in the past, just to give you an idea. So this is the Pacific Northwest, specifically Portland and Seattle. And you'll notice that there's not a lot that they can do to expand, especially Seattle. Seattle's on an isthmus. As a result, land prices are ridiculous. And if everyone has $1 million efficiency condo, because that's the low end in the market, then if you have 1% spare capital, that adds up to a lot of cash real quick. So the Pacific Northwest has got to go not just up the manufacturing scale, because most manufacturing just isn't viable in that market. They've gotten into IT in a very big way. This probably isn't the model for you. I mean, does everyone you know just have a spare $100,000 lying around? Because that's what it takes. I will never tell urban centers to not go into STEM and not try to do stuff with tech, but if you want to do it at scale, I just don't think you have the capital structure for it, because your land is simply too affordable. They went into tech not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. There was nothing else they could try. Charleston. Very similar to the PNW in terms of its inability to expand. They basically live between two rivers. And so they have struck on a double strategy. Number one, they've come up with a really creative way to train their workforce. When they find an investor, they ask what specific jobs need to be filled. And then they work with the state of South Carolina to train up a half a dozen people for each theoretical position. And then they allow the would-be investor to interview them. And if they hire anyone from their pool, the government gets paid a fee to compensate for the cost of the training. And the company gets a ready-made workforce. That's part one. Part two is they convince somebody else to pay for it all. They can do that because they can draw from the populations in upstate, or excuse me, they don't call it upstate there, in-state South Carolina, and they're an ocean port. Why is the ocean port important? Because of what is arguably the dumbest law we have in the United States today. The Jones Act was passed during the Great Depression. The idea was to protect American positions in maritime commerce. And it says that no cargo can be transported between any two American ports unless the ship carrying the cargo is American built, owned, captained, and crewed. As a result, shipments between American ports has dropped by 99% in value over the last century. And one of the reasons you guys do not see ships on the Red River every single minute is because of that law. But foreign ships that come to a port are exempt, so they all go to New Orleans. Any American port on a river has basically been gutted because of this law. So I've been fighting this very lonely one-man war against this stupid law for so long. I honestly think that the Jones Act is the single biggest problem facing American development moving forward. And it's certainly a big issue for you because it means you can't follow the Charleston model because ocean-going vessels can't get this far. You need to have an American ship. And before you think, well, I like the idea of American ships, can you imagine if we did this for any other mode of cargo? Air, that would remove 30% to 50% of the planes in the air. Truck, that would remove 80% of them. Train, over half. We only do this for our most efficient method of transport. That is the very definition of idiocy from my point of view. So yeah, talk to your senator, get rid of that. In the meantime, it's important to understand that you shouldn't trust Texas. Folks, that's 15 million people with a lot of space to expand. And they're slowly metabolizing all the land that's between the four triangle cities. And even with that, the reindustrialization of North America has been going so far. I mean, this isn't a new thing. We've been industrializing at ever-growing pace for about 10 years now. Without the Chinese and the Germans being on the skids, we probably need to double the size of the industrial plant in the United States within the next 5 years, assuming we still want stuff. Americans really like stuff. But Texas, you're a minnow, and you're a ways out. Texas is experiencing labor shortages. The two ways where they're dealing with is by having a 0% income tax to attract more folks in, and by reaching out and holding their nose when they do it and integrating with Oklahoma. Let me underline that. Texas is integrating with Oklahoma on purpose. But OKC and Tulsa have 10 times your population. There's an economy of scale there that you can't match. And if you do manage to integrate yourself into the triangle, it's part of a very dynamic system. It's the fastest growing part of the country. Will be for 30 years. But you're a ways out, and you don't get much of a vote in how it goes. And it wouldn't take much for one suburb of one of these four cities to take what makes you special away. And they'd be a lot closer. It'd be really easy for them to do. So just like with IT, I'm not going to tell you to not go into manufacturing. That would be silly. But you have to have a very realistic approach to what you're going to target. And I think that your geography, combined with the way the global system is changing, provides a lot lower risk, a lot higher value opportunities for you. Let's start with energy. This is total investment from all government and all private into all oil and all natural gas globally. Now, back in 2014 at the peak, a narrative took hold that fossil fuels are done. Not necessarily for directly environmental reasons, but the idea was that it takes 3 to 8 years to bring a conventional field online, and then another 5 to 15 years for that investment to break even. Well, if you're thinking that we need to be to a carbon neutral environment by 2040, we're already past the time window for the investment. So why would you put your money into a project that will never pay you back? Now, I can find a freight train of logical disconnects in that particular logic chain, but it took hold in all of the world's financial centers, and among other things, we got ESG out of that. 3 to 8 years for break even. Stick with that. Now, luckily, what is true for the average is not true for each individual piece. I like to call this the checkbook map, because every dot up there is someone who paid their power bill. Here are the world's conventional oil and natural gas basins. In one snapshot, this is globalization, the agony of globalization, getting the energy from where it's produced to where we actually use it. And this is where the world's commercially viable shale deposits are. There are 20-odd reasons why American energy is fundamentally different compared to the energy complex of every other country. But considering the environment we're in today, this is by far the most important. Here, only here, we produce it where we live. This is the upper Midwest. Has anyone ever done anything other than fly over the Midwest here? Okay. That there is Marshalltown, Iowa, where I'm from. What the hell is this? That's western North Dakota, population 4.5. The half is someone flying over. It's lit up not because there's a frat party, it's lit up because of a problem with transport. Oil's a liquid. It conforms to the shape of the container it's in. You can put it into a rail car, a truck, whatever you want. But natural gas disperses. You have to have a system to gather it, to transport it, to distribute it, to use it, all at the same pace because storage is very difficult and very expensive. Here in the United States, in the shale patches, so much nat gas is bubbling up out of the oil projects as a byproduct. We have to flare it. You can see the flares from space. It's the same in the Permian. It's the same in the Eagle Ford. That's a very different price structure. These producers are basically giving the stuff away just to get rid of it. These red arrows, those are hurricanes. You see these blue spikes? That's Henry Hub. Old story. Storm comes through the Gulf. They shut down everything. They go out after the storm, repair the damage. That's how it was until 2009, because that is the year in the United States, well, in North America, where shale production produced over half of global demand, half of regional demand. Every shale well's on shore. The other two lines are the pricing for Chinese and European natural gas. This little spot right here. Do we have any Texans here? I should know if I'm making fun of someone before I do it. Okay. This little spike right here, this is what happened in January of 21 when Texas got cold. Got down to 25. And everything stopped. Oil, natural gas, solar, wind, nuclear. Oh my God, there were snowmen in San Antonio. They were sad snowmen, but they lasted for 2 weeks. Everyone in Austin just made margaritas. And this right here, this is what we've been dealing with because of the Ukraine war. Back in September, we hit $9, and we lost our minds. $9 in the United States, $9 natural gas. In inflation index terms, that's exactly the 50-year average. We have been bitching about average energy prices. And then you can see what's happening everywhere else. We produce it here. We use it here. We don't import it from a continent away or from a genocidal dictator. We don't have to make an adjustment. And we have a very different pricing structure because of it. This is the new normal, folks. This sort of energy price split between us and the rest of the world. Can you imagine what that does in a competitive, globalized environment? Can you imagine what it does in a deglobalizing system where they can't even get it at all? This is as good as it's going to be for the rest of them for a minimum of 20 years. And natural gas and electricity prices here are in the bottom 10% of the United States. If you can't use energy in greater Shreveport to do something, something is wrong. There are a lot of sectors out there that are energy intensive, that are about to fall into global shortage. And I suggest you move into all of them. Let's start with chemicals. This is a ridiculously overcomplicated graphic. I blame the Europeans. On the right, you start with crude oil. You refine that into tens of thousands of daughter products we use every day with an intermediate step called naphtha. You usually do this through an oil refinery. Or, on the right, you start with natural gas, same general process, but first you have an intermediate step called ethylene. Now, this relatively narrow product set, these are the things that normally you can only make from natural gas. But in the United States, where natural gas is really, really cheap, we use it to do all of this. That's everything from windows to sports equipment to insulation to glass to diapers to makeup to tires. So, you have the Haynesville next door, which is one of the world's great natural gas fields. These are all options. Every circle and square up there is something you could do. And if you don't want to, you can import the stuff from refineries nearby, whether it's New Orleans or Houston, and then do the next step into heavy industry and get into any of those products I just mentioned, plus about 10,000 others. The materials are all right here already. It's heavy manufacturing. You're not making a computer, but you will make the things that allow us to make absolutely everything that we use every day. The most fun of all of these is this little guy right here. That's fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer. So we've lost potash because of the Ukraine war. And because natural gas is so expensive everywhere, but here we're losing nitrogen very, very quickly. That's 2 of the 3 nutrients. We'll talk about the third one here in a minute. All right, let's say you don't like conventional oil and gas, although we're in Shreveport, that would be weird. But there are business opportunities in other things. What we're looking at here is what goes into an electric vehicle versus a normal vehicle. Now, a normal vehicle or a normal power plant, it's really pretty straightforward. You get the fuel in there, you light a match, you set it on fire, you capture the heat. Yes, it's more complicated than that, but it's really, this is old technology. We figured this out 150 years ago. But if you want electricity, you got to do more, because the transmission and the storage, that's really involved in terms of engineering and materials. So this is the type of material that goes into EVs versus conventional vehicles. It's an order of magnitude more complicated, more materials and more of them. Now, we understand in our gut the pain and the complexity of a fossil fuel-based fuel system, because you have to deal with Iran and Iraq and Venezuela and Russia. But if we want to do the green transition, if that is really our goal, then we need to deal with Canada and Mexico and Peru and Chile and Bolivia and Brazil and Argentina and South Africa and Gabon and Congo and Eritrea and Ethiopia and Mozambique and Australia and Vietnam and Indonesia and Malaysia and China and Pakistan and Turkey and Mongolia and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and, oh yeah, still Russia. You think oil geopolitics was a pain in the ass? Oh my God. You're not going to mine lithium here. But every material has to be processed so it can be used. These are the 12 most common materials that go into the green revolution. We need to double the amount of copper. We need 10 times as much nickel and lithium. We need 18 times as much graphite. And processing all of that stuff takes power. Everything that is a red wedge up there is processed primarily in China, and it will be going to zero. We're never going to do the green revolution, not at the scope and the speed that some people think. But we're going to try, and we're going to make some progress. And even if all we want is lithium batteries for our laptops and our phone, we're still going to need more than we have right now, because we're going to lose a lot of what we have right now. And it has to be replaced. And it has to be processed somewhere with maritime access and cheap electricity. Any takers? All right, let's say you want something a little less exotic. You want good old-fashioned steel. Most countries follow the same process. You start on the left here, you get iron ore, you throw it into a blast furnace with usually a bunch of coal. You basically melt the crap out of it and burn off all the impurities. That leaves you with an intermediate product called pig iron, which is useless, but it's a necessary step. That pig iron is then processed on in a more advanced facility, often part of the same complex, into rolled steel. The hot rolled steel is the stuff that's structurally strong, but not necessarily resistant to corrosion, and it's kind of ugly. So it's your car frame or the rebar in concrete. Or the high-end stuff, the cold rolled, that's the shiny stuff. If you can see steel in anything, in your watch, on a roof, that's cold rolled steel, much more expensive. Here in the United States, we don't do a lot of hot rolled steel in the traditional sense. We are the world's greatest steel recyclers. And about 95% of the steel that we use every day has already been used once, twice, 18 times. You can recycle it endlessly. But recycled steel can only be turned into hot rolled. You can't make it pretty, at least not yet. Cold rolled has to be made from pig iron. It has to be virgin steel. We don't do much with foundries. So what we do is we import someone else's pig iron, and we turn it into the highest quality steel in the world, mostly for export. 3/4 of global pig iron came from Iraq. Excuse me, wow, wrong war. 3/4 of global pig iron came from Russia and Ukraine. The Russian stuff is under sanction. We're not taking much of that into law anymore. That nuclear power plant in Ukraine we keep hearing about, that provided every electron of electricity that Ukraine's steel mills operated on. It's all gone. All that's left is Brazil, and there's not enough. So on top of everything else that you might be struggling with inflation, we also have a steel shortage. The things you need to make steel, iron ore, and then coal or electricity. Might not be as sexy as chromium, but wow, we need a bunch of it. All right, let's say you want to grow something instead of mine something. This is where the world's timber comes from. Anyone see a problem here? Russia, one way or another, is going away. Either it's going to win this war and it's going to be under crushing sanctions, or it's going to lose this war and it's going to fall apart. Either way, all of that goes away. Now, I'm not saying that you should go out there and cut down more trees, but this already is a harvesting zone. But because you're close to New Orleans, it is not a processing zone. I don't care if all you do is turn sawdust into pellets or make plywood or make furniture. The options are almost endless. And your proximity to population centers makes this perfect, because this is something Texas can't do because they don't have trees. Let's say you want to grow something you can eat. Here's corn. See a problem with Ukraine? Yeah. Now, there is currently a UN-managed export system that has safe haven pathways from the ports that allow the Ukrainians to export some grains, and they've been preferencing corn to this point because there's more dollar per bushel in it, and they've got to choose what they ship out. So wheat has basically gone to zero. Corn is actually up a little bit. But think about what the Russians are doing right now. The war is stalled, so they're using drones and missiles to target electrical infrastructure throughout the Ukrainian system, causing power outages, trying to cause as many deaths as possible. What do you think they're going to do once summer happens? There's no point in going after the power infrastructure then. They're going to go after the agricultural infrastructure. This is also going to zero. Now, again, I'm not saying go out there and grow more corn, but anything you can do to add value, especially to a sector where you know the world is about to lose one of its major producers, whether you're making grits or pressing it into oil, same logic holds true for soy, same holds true for cotton and cottonseed. There's very little agricultural processing that happens within 500 miles of you. On one side of you, you've got Atlanta. On the other, you've got the Texas Triangle. Ravenous urban zones that need every scrap of value-added commodity they can possibly get their hands on. Grab the whip. What we're looking at here is the three major laser pointer. The three major nutrients that go into all fertilizer. Nitrogen at the top, phosphate at the bottom, phosphate in the middle, potash at the bottom. These numbers here are the percentage that the United States imports. You'll notice for nitrogen and phosphate, we're pretty much self-sufficient. Our problem is potash. But 90% of the potash we get, you can't really read that, but this is Canada. So they're good for something. We only get 12% of one sliver from the conflict zone. Brazil gets over 80% of its fertilizer from the Russian space. Australia, it's about half. Oh, no, it gets worse. Because the rest is roughly evenly split between China and the Middle East. Isn't it crazy? We've forgotten about the Middle East that soon. Spoiler alert, it hasn't gotten any better. And now that the United States is no longer in the middle of all of it, the Saudis and the Iranians are really looking forward to having a nice, dirty little war. And so everything that we've ever thought was a problem with the Middle Eastern energy is a problem with the Middle Eastern energy, but not for us because of the shale revolution. As of November of last year, we were back to a new all-time high. We are once again a net exporter of energy. I hate this graphic. This is the one that gives me nightmares. This is a calorie graphic. Every country in dark blue or dark green is a major producer and exporter of soy and grain-based calories. Everyone else is a net importer. And the countries in red and orange import at least half the calories they consume. The countries with X's are those that, in a world without a reliable fertilizer input system, are looking at least a 40% reduction in their ability to grow the crop in the first place. Deglobalization means a lot of different things for different people. For the United States, it's primarily an opportunity. We've been subsidizing the global system as our commitment to fight the Cold War, but that ended 30 years ago, and we've been backing away ever since. Joe Biden, since he was there when Europe was founded, remembers where Europe is. And we're seeing more security cooperation with the Europeans than we have since the 80s. And I personally think that's great. But there's no guns for butter deal in play here like there used to be. Every trade fight that Donald Trump picked, Biden has continued. In fact, he's taken every tweet that Trump ever sent out and turned it into policy and run it through a really good grammar checker and institutionalized it. We're not going back to the old system. And that means there's a lot of countries facing some critical challenges in just the next few years. And anyone who can take advantage of that by producing and processing foodstuffs for export is going to make an obscene amount of money. Manufacturing is sexy, I get it. But agriculture in North America, that is going to be the fastest growing economic sector in the world for at least the next 4 decades. And the decisions you make today will determine how big of a chunk of that is yours. Final slide. Inflation. This is the United States and Canada, similar economic structures, heavily interconnected. You'd expect the numbers to track, they do. We have 3 big phases in our inflation history since World War II. First of all, we had this first push when we globalized and industrialized. We built the interstate highway systems, we ran power to the countryside, we built our cities. Industrial, demand-driven inflation. Then we get to the 60s and the baby boomers come of age. They raise their kids, they buy their homes, they buy their cars. Consumer, demand-driven inflation. And then we've been living in this weird-ass period. The Chinese brought 1 billion workers to the table and pushed down the cost of manufacturing goods. The Soviet system collapsed, dumping an empire worth of raw materials into global markets. The 2 greatest disinflationary trends recorded in human history, and they lasted for 30 years. Well, folks, the disinflationary trends are turning inflationary. The Chinese labor is literally dying out, and the Russian stuff is going away. And the inflationary trends are back. The boomers may be retiring, but their kids, the millennials, are at the prime of their consuming years. And if we still want stuff, we need an industrial build-out that will double the size of our manufacturing capacity and our processing capacity. We are going to have 9 to 15% inflation annually for a minimum of 5 years. Now, before you have a stroke and call your broker, deep breath. If we do this, if we pull it off, we will have supply chains that are at home, that employ people on this continent, that serve people on this continent. The supply chains will be simpler with fewer steps, that are cleaner, you lose less energy, are more highly skilled, are more efficient, and will be largely immune to international shocks. And we will exit that 5-year transition period with the strongest economy that Mexico, Canada, and the United States have ever seen, and we will have 5 years of the fastest growth in the history of all 3 countries. Or we can still have that inflation and after 5 years not have stuff, which means we have more inflation. From my point of view, this is a really easy call. But I'm not the decision maker. That would be you. No pressure. All right, if you're looking for more, the link on the left goes to my newsletter page, the sign-up page. It is free. It will always be free, and I will never share your data with anyone. However, with all the money that you're saving, you might want to go to the link on the right, because every 6 months I sponsor a new charity. At this moment, I'm going with MedShare. It's an organization that provides medical assistance to communities who can't provide it for themselves because of reasons beyond their own control. So this link goes specifically to their Ukraine page. Okay, I'm done. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear for Peter. What a great job.
Thanks. Thank you.
All right, Peter, we have time for a few questions.
I don't fly out till 5 in the morning. I'm good.
Oh, good. Hopefully you fly out at 5.
Yeah, you know, we'll jump
You
off
never
that
know.
bridge when we get to it.
All right. Unfortunately, because of the time, we can only ask a couple of questions. So, Peter, these questions, we asked the audience to text them to us. They came to my iPhone 7, which I will be upgrading tomorrow before I go to the BMW dealership.
That seems reasonable.
So, we'll do. I don't even drive a BMW.
Well, you will now.
I will
or at
now.
least you'll have one. Yeah.
All right, Peter, here is our first question. Globalization was a huge financial success for the U.S., and for many, it increased quality of life.
Sure.
So why not double down on globalization and do everything we can to hold the systems that support it in place? And is there any way to stop the trajectory that you talk about?
I think we're past that. Politically, I think the United States is mostly done, and if you look at who we've elected since 1989, we've gone with progressively more populist presidents all the way up until Biden. But the economic issue I don't think is sustainable anymore anyway. It was one thing when we did this in 1945, because everyone else in the world was basically wrecked, and our economy was bigger than the rest of the world put together. That's not the world we're in. We've been indirectly subsidizing most of the world for 75 years now. And that has allowed countries who don't have the geography or the access to raw materials or the access to markets to become significant. And the top of that list, of course, is China. So if we could do a share and turn back some time and go back to 2001, there was a moment under George W. Bush when we were trying to basically, this is going to sound a little jaded, but beat Russia and China into shape. And say, you know, the Cold War system is over. We're entering a fundamentally new era. We need to renegotiate the terms of globalization. And if you do that, great, we're all in this together. And if you don't, we will bury you. And then 9/11 happened. And we got a little distracted for 20 years. And in that time, we maintained enough of the structures of globalization that all these places that had poor geographies kept growing. And now collectively, they're twice our size. We can't subsidize things of that size, unless, of course, we want to spend all of our national blood and treasure making sure that China is the unassailable superpower. I don't think that's going to fly.
Peter, our next question. Do you think declining demographics in the developed world is our #1 security issue for the United States?
No, because you remember ours, right? Ours are pretty good. I mean, we're still aging and we still have these distortions when we go from the big boomers to the small Xers to the big millennials to the small Zers. But these are problems we can manage over time. In addition, we are partnered with Mexico, which has the healthiest demography, not just in the rich world, but in the advanced developing world as well, better than India, better than Indonesia or Turkey. And so if there were two countries that were better positioned to do well, it would be those two. And the fact that they're already linked together in a trade deal, I mean, there are a lot of things about Donald Trump I was not a fan of. NAFTA 2 was freaking brilliant, and it's done. It's embedded into the system, and this political sniping that we see around the world in our own country doesn't really apply to NAFTA. I mean, Biden and the Mexican president, AMLO, they loathe each other, personally, professionally, ideologically, and they just got done with the Three Amigos Summit. It was the most successful summit we have had with NAFTA since 2006. So this is a relationship that works, and no one else has something like that. So will I mourn Europe when it's gone? Yeah, because that's less than 20 years away. But time isn't gonna stop. And courtesy of none other than Donald Trump, we now have a multiracial future of cooperation. And that just feels weird. But that's where we are.
So make your vacation plans now to go to Europe, is what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, France will last longer. France has a demography that's a lot more like ours. So, you know, you can put off going to Paris for a few years, it'll still be there. But if you're gonna go to Germany, honestly, you are running out of time. Sorry.
I'll stop at a travel agent tomorrow on the way to the BMW dealership.
Or maybe on the way back.
Even better,
Yeah.
even better. Is Northwest Louisiana's heavy dependence on oil and gas a plus or a minus for us in an economic development sense?
As long as you think of oil and gas as a source of income as opposed to a source of electricity, it's a negative, because you're kind of going to get that whole, the Dutch disease, where you're over-dependent on one specific thing that's cyclical in its demand. But if you use it to do other things, well, holy crap, there's not a whole lot of sectors that you couldn't go into. The biggest problem that you guys have is you just don't have another population center that's near you. And that makes it really difficult for you to synergize and achieve economies of scale. And that's why I think you should go into processing, because you have something here that is bottled up. And so for you, and mostly only for you, it's at a cost structure that no one else can match. You should use that.
Peter, our last question of the night. With our relationship with China waning, how can Shreveport and the area benefit from the return of manufacturing?
I'm not saying you shouldn't try, but you're going to be a very small minnow in a pond that is not close to you. And that's a very risky proposition. So will there be niche things that you can expand into? Sure, but I don't think you're going to be able to do it at scale. But if you build out the things that allow manufacturers to function, you will be absolutely indispensable. And it's far better for you to own Texas than the other way around.
Let's end it with one last question. Is the United States, are we going to be all right in this global economy?
We're going to bitch and we're going to moan, but we're going to be fine. Let me go through this one group at a time. Okay, baby boomers, they're retiring, but they are going to have the voting capacity to make sure that no one takes away their benefits for at least another 15 years. Damn it. Gen X, small generation, we're now the capital providers. One of the reasons that the baby boomers have been a little bit stressed out and very willing to vote themselves benefits is their money has been out competing, it's been oversupplied. The rate of return has been really low. That's going to reverse with Gen X. So Gen Xers that are able to invest are probably going to see the biggest returns in financial history for the next 15 years. It will be a fight to make sure that the government doesn't take it, and the boomers will try. Don't let them. Millennials, a little late to the start, but they're now having kids in numbers. They are literally the future. And the millennials they've got a lot of negative connotations, and I could talk for an hour on that. Let's focus on the positive. They're congenial, they're cooperative, they're collaborative, they're good at the touchy-feely skills, they're great managers, They are the people who will not just solve problems, but manage everything, and they've got the personal characteristics necessary to do that at scale. And they're consumers. Then you've got Gen Z, the new kids. Gen Z were not millennials. So, the millennials were raised by the boomers, and they were told that they were special, and we don't keep track of the score at the soccer game, and this gave them very high senses of self, which can be a problem, but this is why they're so open and friendly and cooperative. The Zoomers are the children of Gen X, and we raised our kids knowing that Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security would never be there for them, and we know that you can trust no one, and you have to be better than everyone, not better than the millennials, that's easy. And you have to put in the hours, and then you have to put in more hours, and you can't rely on anyone. So they are pathologically hard workers, and they're very loyal to their employers because they see their employers as giving them a lifeline. But they never want to meet you. Their dream job is to work in a closet that locks from the inside. So if you need coders, we've got a whole generation ready to go. But if you want anything else, you got to turn to the millennials. This is a cultural mix that can really work. I mean, there are negatives about every generation, there are positives about every generation, but at the age bracket we're in right now, we're going to have a highly productive financial sector. We're going to have rock bottom prices for IT because of the Zoomers. And in the middle, managing all the details, you've got people who actually like to be in the same room together. This works. Everywhere else, the boomers are leaving and there's no one else to pick up the baton.
Peter, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Zeihan.
Thank you.